All right, so continuing on with our design of plyometric training programs. So one of the things we look at is program length. As far as the effectiveness, most individual programs range from about 6 to 10 weeks. However, what they found is that the vertical jump height that individuals can see can happen as soon as 4 weeks after the start of a plyometric training program. Now, again, over the course of the year, you're going to kind of want to manage your loads and the types of exercises that you're doing. So, for instance, obviously, you want to make sure that you have an appropriate progression for athletes based upon, and we'll discuss more about this later, about their training experience, so that they could kind of adapt to the different exercises that they're going to be performing. So from a progression standpoint, again, it is a form of resistance training, and it has to follow a similar idea of progressive overload. Okay, so again, we systematically increase training frequency, volume, and intensity. This is just what I was talking about before. So, I mean, your muscles and everything are still having to work, your body's still having to recover, and your nervous system's going to have to recover. So you're going to have to consider, as a part of your long-term planning, how you're kind of implementing the plyometrics. So first of all, you need to look at, what type of exercises are you doing, how often are they going to be doing them, and then kind of look long term at how you're going to be progressively loading them over the course of their weeks to months, whatever, however long you'd be training them, and just apply that principle of progressive overload. So again, we want to start with a warm up, and this is something that we'll maybe kind of play around with a little bit more in class. So again, you have to include, a general warm up. And again, your stretching could be a little bit more of a dynamic type stretching. We'll kind of go through and maybe work through some warm ups that we can do prior to a plyometric program, and then gradually specific. And ideally, you want to do some low intensity dynamic movements. Remember, when you're doing a warm up, you want to think about making, starting out with low intensity things, progressing to high intensity. Start with like low amplitude range of motion, move to high amplitude range of motion. You want to progress a warm up. So that's why I say there's not necessarily like a perfect warm up. There's no perfect exercises to do. It's all kind of in how you structure them. So, start your warm up least specific to most specific. You kind of want to end with something that is, maybe a little bit more intense. Like for instance, just in a lot of warm ups that I do, I tend to end a lot of warm ups with some sort of like sprinting activity, because that's sort of like the end of it, and then that takes them into their higher intensity activity. If you're specifically warming up for a plyometric session, you probably want to end with some type of light jumping or light activity that involves the stretch shortening cycle prior to what they're going to do. So those are things to look at when you're kind of designing this, and deciding what you're doing for a warm up. Now, age considerations, again, you want to, particularly when you're looking at younger individuals, you want to consider both physical and emotional maturity. So, and with the emotional maturity, you want to look at, can they take instructions? Because we obviously know that, kids have to be able to understand what they're doing so that they do them properly. Okay, under proper supervision, appropriate program, prepubescent, adolescent children can perform plyometric exercises very easily. You do want to watch. You're obviously not going to be looking to do depth jumps or higher intensity lower body plyometrics, because typically they're not going to have the physical capacity to be able to handle them. They need to have they need to have a workup to that prior to doing it. So again, the primary goal is to develop neuromuscular control and anaerobic skills that will carry over into the adult athletic population. So it's a progression from them. Progress from simple to complex. Again, just some low amplitude, for instance, ankle hops. And again, as you're going through this, and this is the second video you're watching here, go back and look at the exercises. So after you take your notes with this, go back and look at the exercises and start to think about what exercises you would pick early on and kind of how you would do them. Your recovery time should be a minimum of 2 to 3 days. And again, that's going to be for both structural recovery and neurological recovery, for them to be able to continue on with this, because you don't want to load them too quickly. Now, another population we want to look at is our masters athletes and older athletes or older individuals who want to take place. Because even for the general population, stressing their neuromuscular system is actually very beneficial from an injury prevention standpoint, just from a health standpoint. So plyometric programs should include no more than 5 low to moderate intensity exercises for your masters athletes. Again, your volume should be a little bit lower. So again, as individuals do age, you don't need as much volume per se, particularly with things like this. And again, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis how low the volume goes. You know, are they somebody who have trained their whole life? They've always been active. Obviously, they can kind of do a little bit more work than somebody who hasn't. But you want to make sure that they have good strength, that they're able to kind of tolerate the volume. And your recovery time should be 3 or 4 days. So, you know, as individuals do age, the recovery process does take a little bit more. As you get older, even if you're in good condition, your body doesn't tend to recover the same way it did when you were younger. Okay, so, you know, someone who's 50 isn't going to recover the same way they did when they were 25. Okay, even if they're still in really good condition. And again, you know, if you do happen to at some point work with the general population, don't neglect doing these stretch shortening cycles activity, you know, from the standpoint of, you know, fall prevention and things like that. Just the neuromuscular activity that you can get out of it, if it's deemed appropriate for the person, it can certainly be a benefit. Okay, so obviously we're going to be looking at when we're programming, we're not going to ever be exclusively really doing any one form of exercise. So we have to consider how we're combining plyometric exercise with other forms of exercise. So plyometric exercise and resistance training, there's different ways you can do this. Now, one way, and there's some ways I like better personally than others, but your book gives various examples. One way is combining lower body resistance training with upper body plyometrics, and then vice versa. So you could certainly do that. The only trouble that I sometimes see with that, now again, it depends on how your overall program is set up, is that locally you might have some more fatigue just because, you know, you're spreading this all out over the course of the week. So, but it is certainly one way you can do it depending upon how you structure your other days. Be cautious with heavy resistance training and plyometric exercise on the same day. Your book says that you can't combine heavy resistance with plyometrics. You can do it. Again, it just kind of depends upon your setup. Plyometrics will typically be done first in the program. So if you are doing your resistance training and plyometrics on the same day, in a very like common structure, your plyometrics would get performed first. Because it's more of a mechanical power-based activity. Now, some advanced athletes may benefit from what's called complex training. So what complex training is doing a heavier resistance training exercise and then following that with a plyometric exercise. So this is kind of like that more advanced type of method, or a little asterisk that would go next to the we'll always do your plyometrics first. So if an athlete has a very good training background and it's something that they can do, that is something that you could incorporate. So I've done this with athletes once they've had probably about a year's worth of experience, and you've kind of built up a certain level of strength, or maybe they've plateaued. But this is definitely one of those things that you don't want to necessarily put too early. It's kind of one of those things, kind of keep it in your back pocket. For maybe if somebody gets a little stale or something and they've been training for a while, it's something that could kind of, get them over a sticking point. So these are just some examples from your book. So they're showing you a sample scheduling. Now, again, here's the problem that I see with this. Now, they're doing high and low for upper body and lower body. Again, I'm not going to say you can't train this way. You certainly could, but I think there's a chance that locally you might possibly get some fatigue. So if you look at this, they're showing high intensity upper body resistance training, low intensity lower body plyometrics, and then they're going low intensity lower body resistance training, high intensity upper body plyometrics. Again, it would depend on what your volumes are. What I personally prefer, I would typically do all my high intensity lower body plyometrics and then the strength training on the same day, just watching the volumes, because I just think it's better for the nervous system and for structural recovery. So this could be certainly something that we talk about a little bit more in class, because this is one of those things where there's certainly multiple ways. So what I'm just going to ask of you is, try to, again, think of some questions that you may have about like structuring this, or start just even in your head, kind of start to play around with how you might look at this in regards to an overall, weekly training schedule. Plyometric and aerobic exercise. So again, because aerobic exercise may have negative effects, you want to make sure you do your plyometric exercise before aerobic endurance training, which that would make sense. So if you're doing aerobic endurance training on the same day, you're going to do your plyometrics first. And again, always be thinking like, powerful, fast type activities where there's a lot of where there's more velocity related. Those you're always going to be pretty much doing first if you're doing everything on the same day. Now, if you're doing two separate sessions, you could certainly mix that up, whether you do one in the morning, one in the evening. That's a little different because you're going to have recovery in between. But if you're doing them in the same session, I've never had athletes that could do 2-a-days with their training. So, for me, like if I was putting both of these in the same day, the plyometrics would always be getting performed first. So some safety considerations. So we want to look at pre-training evaluation of the athlete. Again, technique is always going to be the biggest thing. And one of the big things, obviously, particularly for the lower body plyometrics, is we look at landing. So we want to make sure that the individuals have proper landing technique before they get into any major lower body plyometric work. So we're going to be working on that landing technique and just making sure that individuals are pretty much ready to go regarding being able to land safely with their plyometrics. So the positioning, these are some key points when we look at positioning for plyometrics. So the shoulders are in line with the knees, kind of helps place the center of gravity over the base of support. The knees are over the toes. You should not have any excessive inward valgus movement, which can increase the risk of lower extremity injury. So you should not see that kind of knock-knee positioning when you're doing it. So these are kind of some of the big things you want to look at. There's a picture on the next slide that you could kind of see, and we'll kind of go through it, kind of illustrating all these different points. So here you have your good landing position. So if you're looking here, so the knees don't come past the toes. They kind of just go over the toes. You kind of see the hips back a little bit more. You kind of want to see them kind of sitting back. If you're getting the knees too far forward, what that means is that they're very quad dominant and they're trying to basically use their quadriceps to kind of help with the deceleration of the landing, which they should help, but you want to make sure that the posterior chain's involved. You kind of see that the shoulders are in line with the knees. So basically what you're seeing here is this straight line. You're kind of seeing the body over its base of support. When you're looking at a frontal view, you shouldn't see any inward movement of the knees, okay? So the knees should never drop inside that first metatarsal on the foot. So you kind of see she's got good positioning here, that knee's not coming in. What you'll see with a lot of people, particularly those with weak hip abductors, their knees will kind of collapse and you'll kind of see them almost go knock-kneed. You'll see the knee kind of go inside that first toe, and that's what you don't want to see with your landing. If they have a problem with that, you would want to then, one of the exercises you can use is just a depth drop, which is basically just landing off of a box. And although it's not a classic plyometric, it's a box drill that you can do to help prepare them to do plyometric. So it teaches them that deceleration and that force absorption, which can be very beneficial for them when they're going through their plyometric training. And plus, just from an injury prevention standpoint, being able to absorb force is very important.